Thank you. So to start off, we're about to head into the keynote. But I wanted to share two very short stories to maybe push off from or frame. One thing is, so I live in Iceland. And there was a morning not too long ago when my 8-year-old walked out into our living room and she kind of looked around the corner and she looked out the window and there was fire and smoke. And she yelled back into the bedroom where we were, "Mom, Dad, there's a volcano." And later that week, I was on a call with my friend Ludmila, who lives in Kiev. And the fire and smoke that her kids are encountering is very, very different. That's the fire and smoke of bombs or drones. There was another story that I wanted to share. Thomas and I, preparing for this particular session, we had a conversation with someone who is from the east part of Ukraine. And we wanted to bring in the world that we live in. And so as we were talking to her about her work, then she told us, she's like, "This is great, but this should have been done 5, 10, 15, 30 years ago. That's when we should have had those conversations." And somehow, there's also that possibility that even for the Nordic countries, for the context that we are in, maybe that's where we are. Maybe we're closer than that, to a very, very different reality. So with that, I wanted to invite Dave Snowden, Jenny Grettve, or Sara Lindeman to take the stage. And one of the prompts that we've been playing with, that I loosely want to just introduce, is when are we? And also, what's worth doing now in times like these? Sara, I'm going to leave to you to start.
Okay, hi, good morning, everyone. Hi, Dave. Hi, Jenny.
Hello.
Okay, I was kind of brought in by Amit and Thomas here to hold the perspective of Finland. And in doing that, sort of tuning into that, I was a bit like, okay, do I have the stats? Do I have the information? Am I on top of daily politics? And I'm not. And I started to think, okay, so from which place do I hold the space of Finland? And I kind of realized that I'm only sort of, I can do that from my own experience of, being from Finland, living in Finland and all of that. And then I started to think about that experience and how limited that probably is. And I also started thinking about, like, to which extent do I have a lived sense of other people's experiences right now, their lived experiences of being in Finland. And I realized that I probably don't know all that well. We have really high unemployment rate. There's a lot of cuts in budgets on NGOs, the culture sector. There's a lot going on. And, but what I noticed is that, you know, I would want to know. I would like to have a sense of understanding of other lived experiences. So, and this question of like, does it that they would matter to me? So if to the question, when are we, maybe that's where we are. We are quite separated, I think. But there's maybe still an interest and some kind of sense of coherence or an intention towards that. And having said that, maybe what we also maybe have is evidently we have, you know, collective trauma from 2 wars, and I think that collective trauma is very alive in, you know, high domestic violence rates, high need for therapy and emotional expression, and these kinds of elements of where are we and when are we. But thinking of that collective trauma, it was also somehow came to me that it's maybe not just the trauma. And maybe in a way, when I think about the trauma is something we have in common, which is maybe a good thing, because that's something in this, when we are, you know, now being more and more separated, we have a shared trauma. Maybe that's something that unites us. And I think it's very like, you know, all people with you know, ancestry in Finland, we have the stories, quite lived experiences from the war, and these kinds of that, you know, are particular for each family, but they are there and they're quite vivid. But I also started reflecting that this is this morning's reflections that it's not just the trauma, it's also these collective action that we have had to take. So there has been periods of, you know, we need to come together in order to be. So that is also a shared experience that we have. And you know, slightly with mixed feelings, I want to. I don't know if I want to, but I will share a personal story related to this. And I'm a bit long now, but maybe it's okay. I can be. My mother and my sister are here in the audience, which is lovely. I can't see you right now, but with their permission, we have when we think of this, like maybe when we're in this time now, where do I start this story? We have in our family, my great-grandfather was really involved before the First World War to organize the resistance. And this is a very alive, like sort of family story for us. And at the time then, Finland was under Russian rule. And previously the Russian rule had been quite beneficial for Finland, setting up all our sort of government institutions and so forth. So we actually became like a nation. So it had been beneficial. Anyone to correct me if my history is, but that's the understanding. But then it started to go towards cultural oppression, to become pressured for Finland to become Russian in all kinds of ways throughout the country. And in response to this, there was a resistance that started to secretly organize. And this organization happened very vividly in the sort of western city of Vaasa, where we're from. And this happened very much as one of the collective actions. And our ancestor was a very silent, modest lawyer who worked in the countryside, so skiing around in the different communities. And while doing this, he started organizing the resistance together with a handful of people. And they did this, and this was a huge collaboration between everyone involved. There were fishermen, there were farmers, they were hiding weapons, they were young boys were volunteering to go to Germany to be trained as military professionals because we had no military. And they did this, and my sister Maria, who's here, is doing a really interesting art project about that. There, yes, there. So they were doing this in clandestine and the risks were really high. Like if they would get caught, it would be a train to Siberia, you know, point final. And so we have that, you know, somewhere in our bones. And here we are now. And what's happening? And the society is changing, clearly. And how are we responding? How are we... one is, what is the change? It is also a culture but what is the change now? That's what we've been talking about. And how are we responding? And are we just gonna watch it happen? Or are we going to do something about it? And also, I had mixed feelings about sharing this because it is a bit like, you know, we share some kind of bedtime story about ghosts or whatever. It's a bit like, ooh. But then or we talk about the polar crisis and it's a bit like, and then we go away. But that's kind of, you know, And I was thinking yesterday, it's maybe not what we do. It's now the question is how. How are we going to do it? How on earth are we going to do it? And are we actually going to do it, or are we going to watch it happen, you know, without our response? So that's kind of like, at least for me, a very vivid, you know, when are we in Finland and when and elsewhere now? Let's stop there.
Thank you. I'll add on a little bit, since if we talk about space and cultures, I'm Swedish, and we have another type of trauma from, let's say, over the past 100 years, that is one of shame, because we, or as, I mean, is this still fun? Yeah. We took a very ugly step away from standing up for peace, for each other, for the collective. We were only thinking about ourselves as a country. And I think it affects how we step into today, to current problems. And I think it was beautiful when you said, I don't know. And I think that's a sentence we rarely say, because we are so filled with shame or with fear or with insecurities, and to say I don't know is a really bad thing. Whereas I think it should be the opposite, and maybe that's when we can, where we could start. I don't know. Then we turn a page and we go, what do you think of a collective kind of take on the time we're in? But also just to say, because a lot of people don't know who I am, I guess. So, I'm an architect, but I work at the moment for an EU institution, and a lot of my work is about resilience and about connecting people and countries and, you know, society as a whole through culture and creativity. And I was reading up a little bit also this morning and yesterday evening on Dave. I was like, what has Dave done recently? Went into his LinkedIn page, and I have my business card says Head of Transformation. And just a few days ago, Dave posted, I think we should cancel the word transformation. So I would love to hear what you mean by that, and what should I have on my business card, and how does that weave into the times we're in?
The really scary thing about that is I did the sort of British satirical thing, which we're brought up to. You know, satire and is a rhetorical weapon. And I said, next we'll be on to eschatological realization.
Which was such a tricky word.
Which well, I was a liberation theologian if I go back to the 70s, all right? So I know this stuff. It's the end of times. And somebody has taken it seriously and decided their practice is now going to be about realizing the end of days. So it's quite depressing, really, all right? It's like you should never use irony on Americans because they don't understand it, all right? So a couple of points on this. I think one of the things is we need to start to, there is a North Atlantic, and I refuse to say Western or Eastern because that's wrong. Yeah, there is a North Atlantic culture which actually goes back to the Reformation, which privileges the individual over the collective. Yeah, and you can see that extensively. If you come to Wales, where I'm from, on identity tests, we score the same way as Africans and Asians because we're a tribal culture. Yeah, which means we're constantly at war with each other, right? If, I was in Washington and somebody said to me, I've met the Welshman working on counterterrorism. And I said, oh, where does he come from? And he said, that's what he asked about you. And I said, you need to understand the way we work, right? First of all, is he Welsh or is he English? That's important, all right? Is he North or South Wales? If he's South Wales, is he East or West? I will find a way in which I can have a fight. That's how tribal cultures work, right? Now, there's some interesting research on this, and I might as well, I think I want to make what may or may not be a controversial statement in this audience. We need to stop focusing on ourselves and our attitudes and start focusing on what we do collectively. It's what I call the inner development goal error. The inner development goals are a fundamental error in terms of change in society. Effectively, it's lotus eating. It allows a bunch of very privileged people to gather together in Stockholm and agree that the world would be better if everybody thought like them. And that's called colonialism. Yeah, in its various forms. And it is a problem, right? It's this individual type issue. So a couple of stories on this to make the point. I was in the Ukraine earlier on this year. And it was an interesting experience. I wasn't allowed by the British government to go to Kiev, but I was in Lviv. They put me on the wrong train to get me to the Polish border, so I almost ended up in Kiev, and that was an interesting experience in social media, translation on phones, and finally getting off the train at the right point and going back. If you don't know, to get to Ukraine at the moment, you have to go via Poland, so you either have a long train journey or a long drive, you cross the border. It's a 6 to 8 hour saga, yeah, overnight. And I got to the border with Poland, and the security guard who checked my passport took me off the train. I thought, oh my God, I'm in trouble. And I discovered there were 15 security guards lined up. They all wanted to shake my hand because I've been prepared to go there, yeah, and spend time with people. And I think that's actually quite important. We're increasingly working in a world which is disintermediated, where we lack that actual contact and that interaction. And a lot of our work on peace and reconciliation, for example, is focused on bringing people together. And this is a key complexity principle of working obliquely, not directly. Again, this is a fundamental error. Talking about problems directly doesn't work. If anybody's got teenage children, you already know this, all right? It doesn't work, all right? So a complexity principle is obliquity. So I did this first in the 70s in Northern Ireland. And there were two approaches to peace and reconciliation. One was to get everybody together in a large room. I make no direct comparisons at this point. Sort of get them all to agree that the world would be a better place if everybody loved each other and saw peace and harmony and understanding. Actually, I hate to tell you this, but poems were also read, all right? Now, there's nothing wrong with this. I love poetry. I need to go back to writing some again from longer. So everybody, and at the end of this, everybody was in a state of peace and harmony and the world would be a better place. But within days, they were throwing petrol bombs at each other again. If anybody has seen Derry Girls, which is one of the best comedies ever to come out of the British Isles, and we've produced quite a few, it's a story of young teenage girls growing up in Derry in the Troubles. Oh, and by the way, I'm Catholic, so I call it Derry. If I was Protestant, I called it Londonderry, all right? There's one of the great Wikipedia compromises is it's Derry for the city, Londonderry for the county, all right? I was part of that compromise. Now, that didn't work, all right? And it's brilliant, all right? The Catholic girls are forced into a peace and reconciliation process with the Protestant boys. The Catholic girls have other intentions about the Protestant boys, which the Protestant boys aren't happy with, all right? But that's the process, and it ends up with a massive, physical fight over a minor misunderstanding. And go and watch it, all right? It's brilliant. I can send you the clip. We took a very different approach. I was then going to be a Jesuit, so that's another story from my past. We took 2 Catholics and 1 Protestant, or 2 Protestants and 1 Catholic, and we dumped them into the slums of Rio de Janeiro for 3 months on an ecumenical project. And they discovered pretty fast that they had more in common than they realized. And they had conversations about their political and religious differences without some white middle-class idealist facilitator trying to tell them how they should think. And that built lasting relationships. Now, some of our current work, which, to be honest, we're trying to get funded at a world scale, but we're doing it on a wider level, is to actually use school children as ethnographers to capture stories from their community at scale. Yeah, and I want to make this point really strongly. There is no point in having workshops where people come together to talk about problems, because the people who can solve the problems are never in those workshops. Yeah, it's a problem with government labs, and most citizen engagement actually doesn't engage the people who need to solve the problem at scale. Right? So we have educational systems. We all envy Finland, by the way, on this. I know you have an angst about it at the moment. The rest of the world is thinking, could we have that too? And abolishing private education is something I would do tomorrow if I could. All right. So either way, so school children are ideal. Brain plasticity starts to change at around just post-puberty, if you don't know it. So by early 20s female, late 20s male, prejudice is now sort of part of the way we are. So that sort of immediate post-puberty period is a key area in which people are curious, they will inquire. So we use them as ethnographers. We then identify issues or problems which are in common with people from different backgrounds. And this is the new stuff. I'll be talking about this on Tuesday, actually, in Helsinki in a class. We then algorithmically, without human agency, and that's deliberate, allocate money to them if they will work together on the problem that they already know they share. And the concept on that is to build empathy. I'll come back to my Ukraine story. Because the way you combat populism, the way you combat hatred, is to make people people again. And you do that by working together, not by talking about it. Yeah, that's key. And a final point on this, and this comes from Gerber's work and others in anthropology and also theoretical biology. Sorry, we use natural science to determine methods. We don't. My background is physics and philosophy, all right? So the peril of being a philosopher is Socrates' peril, in that you can't not ask questions even if the citizens vote for you to commit suicide, right? That's the Socrates problem. And the problem about being a physicist is no social scientist ever has enough data to form any valid conclusion. Yeah, we used to say they suffer from physics envy, which was a deliberate play on words, all right? So we use natural science on this, all right, a lot. But if you look at it, human beings did not evolve to make decisions as individuals. Freud and Jung did a major disservice to actually the whole of the organizational change movement, because they focus on nonsensical concepts like subconscious, which doesn't exist, or things like mental models, which was a cute concept 50 years ago, but actually isn't true. You know, we don't process things through mental models. That's called the intelligent camera. But we evolved to make decisions collectively. And the primary units are sexual pairs, which, by the way, if you go back into Neolithic times, are not necessarily male-female, but there's a sexual pair which is important. That's primary nurture. There are then extended families, stroke hunting groups, which, interestingly, the active decision makers never exceed 7. Yeah, normally it's about 5. We evolved to compromise in groups of 5. We do not compromise in larger groups. Now that actually is a fundamental impact. You then get what are called deems, which are hunting groups of maybe 20, 30. And in summer, those deems will actually compete with each other. They're competing because there's abundant resource. But in winter, and this is the key lesson I want to come to, we come to macro deems. So macro deems are 5, 800, 700, 800, which is where the hunting parties who've competed in summer come together because they have to cooperate to survive. Yeah? And they don't cooperate by agreeing that they will be nice to each other, they cooperate by building monuments. That's where things like Stonehenge come from. So there's a critical aspect in human change is we evolve to do things together collectively, not to have existential angst about how we're feeling about the subject. Yeah, if you want to change things, you need to engage people at all levels, and that's where narrative comes into its own. And by the way, you will not see, I mean, Nora yesterday, myself today, neither of us will ever talk about how people should behave or how they should think. That's their own choice. Both of us change, well, 2 seconds, both of us change the way they interact, and then the behavior emerges from that. So in fact, if you look at it, we evolved to be capitalists in summer and socialists in winter. And we're now working into winter.
Nice. No, but I was... I know you work a lot with complexity. So this summer, I had a friend who gave me a book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Physic, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
That's the 70s, that's my childhood.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I was reading it, and it was a very masculine take on systems thinking, you could say. A lot of motorcycle maintenance. But it was one thing in that book that still is stuck with me, and it was because I can't remember the name of the author, but
Physic.
Yeah, he said that I mean we want to kind of understand everything about our existence and life, and through science, and once we have proven something, it's like another 10 doors open, because then we need to keep proving things. And in my mind then, I mean, that the world just becomes more and more complex the more we understand and the more knowledge we have. Whereas, and then going back to my gut data, that I like to call it instead of a gut feeling, but I'm longing for simplicity. And I think also when listening to you, there's so much in like being human that is also simple. So how do we deal with both complexity and simplicity? Okay. And then another thing, also listening to you, it's a lot of masculine worlds. Also when we talk about rebels, if we talk about wars, I mean, I picture men. So how do we talk about gender in complexity and simplicity?
Okay, so you've raised something which I'm going to use mercilessly, all right? Which is systems thinking is masculine. I've always felt that. I hadn't articulated that way. It's brilliant, right? And you can see that because systems thinking wants to define the system. It thinks you can see the system holistically. Yeah, and it thinks everything is feedback loops that you can map and model. And complexity science comes from a very different background. So complexity recognizes inherent uncertainty. And I don't think it's particularly, I think actually, and I will say, my experience in IBM where I lived is the women who were vice presidents were more masculine than the males. Yeah, you could do a token surrender to a male and they would nip your neck like a wolf does, and now you're part of the pack. The women would rip your throat out so you couldn't come back and threaten their children. So we need to be careful about gender stereotypes in this, all right? And one of my favorite people I know in the Ukraine is a woman in her early 30s who's now effectively a brigadier with no military experience before the Russians invaded. No? So I think context is more important than gender or race or anything else. And I think that's one of the things you get from complexity. I think also we need to be very careful of what I call faux mysticism.
Faux mysticism?
Faux mysticism. I can send you the definition of this. So one of the phenomena you see in the States is what I call faux Buddhism. Now they're now getting bored with Buddhism, so they're now adopting Taoism. No? So the idea is you take something which you call wisdom. The wisdom words I think we should avoid. Yeah, and the way that indigenous people are exploited really worries me on this, and I spent years working with indigenous people in Australia. So now they have to be wise. So we take something we don't fully understand and we use it to give ourselves mystical authority. Right? And that's a real problem. It's a misuse of religion, and religion is pretty fundamental to what we are as a species anyway. You can't not be religious if you're human. I mean, if you look at Dawkins, if you've ever seen his website, he's got testimonies to people who became atheists after they heard him preach. It's like an Old Testament model, right? So I think we want to avoid, I mean, one of the things I'm interested in is identity. So if you look at citizen assemblies, for example, people are selected on a statistical basis on gender, age, etc. One of the things we're working on is how do you select people based on identity? Yeah, because actually you want diversity of identity. I mean, this group here has very little identity diversity. It may have other diversities, but the identity diversity isn't sufficient to represent things. So I think we need to sort of break beneath the sort of classic stereotypes of male, female, yeah, of black, white, of whatever, all right? And we need to say we need to bring diversity. And I think there's a fundamental test I would always do. So in an academic audience, you can talk academically. This is a middle-class educated audience. I'm not afraid of talking about the science. But if we're working in an area where people don't have the privilege of that education, then you have to talk in a different language. And interestingly, that's where stories come in. I mean, our whole focus is to gather stories and allow people to interpret their own story rather than have it interpreted by AI or a sociologist, for example. And stories are a universal means of communication. You can talk in stories to people from radically different backgrounds in different ways. And if you ever argue with a Sufi philosopher, which I would strongly recommend, Nora used a Mullah Nasruddin story yesterday with the lighthouse. Yeah, I'll tell you a Mullah Nasruddin story to finish this. If you ever argue with a Sufi philosopher, you can't argue it logically, you have to argue in a story competition, which is far more vicious than a logical argument, all right? Story competitions are really scary, and I've done a few of them. So to give an illustration of that, every now and then somebody in IBM, so I survived 7 months in the Jesuits and 7 years in the IBM before I failed the test of obedience, all right? That represents a different maturity of the two organizations. But they'd say, couldn't you make this idea simpler? Because they were stuck in a systems thinking background, and I was arguing complexity science is radically different, right? Particularly when you fuse it with anthropology. And I'd say, well, no, I actually can't. And then they'd say, well, you've got to. So they want platitudes. When people say they want something simple, they often mean they want management platitudes. I know you're not doing that, but... So I used to put out this story. It's a Mullah Nasruddin story. Mullah Nasruddin is the wise fool in the Sufi tradition. And he lives in a city. So the Mullah Nasruddin lives in a city. He's only ever seen pigeons. One day, a hawk lands on his windowsill. So he looks at it and he says, you poor bird. And he clips its talons and clips its wings and clips its beak. So it looks like a pigeon. He said, there you are, now you're a real bird. Now, that was the most effective argument I ever deployed, because it created something that people could resonate with. And I think that's one of the other things we need to start bringing back. It's the ability to tell stories, but it's also the ability to own your own story. And in an AI-dominated world, we're not owning our own stories anymore.
No, absolutely.
Well, maybe I could... Oh, I have to...
You have to play the pop star.
Yes.
That's why I don't like those.
I was wondering this feminine, masculine discussion in the stories, living systems that we were working with yesterday. One concern is, say we have a meadow, and then we have a bulldozer. The bulldozer will take down the meadow, and how do we? This is maybe something or a concern that we've been thinking about. If you want to organize now in terms of complexity as living systems, how do we create an immune system? How do we not get bulldozed? How do we sort of, in a world that is building up for war?
Okay, this gets really difficult, all right? And first of all, I don't think masculine and feminine works in this context. And part of the issue is you grew up in a masculine society. I grew up in a matriarchy.
Yeah.
Wales and Ireland are matriarchies.
Yeah.
I mean, you're scared shitless of your mother, right? The Welsh mam is a fearsome figure. If your grandmother is angry with you, beg forgiveness. And if your great-grandmother is angry with you, leave the country and wait for permission to re-enter.
But when you say you grew up, do you mean me as a person or Swedish
Finland.
society or
I'm
Finland? Yeah, exactly.
So I think if you grew up in a matriarchal environment, and interestingly, Welsh law in the 6th century allowed women to divorce their husband for cruelty and take half his land. And that was cited by the English king in the 14th century as a reason why we were uncivilized. Right? So anybody from a farming background is not going to use the bulldozer, whether they're male or female. They'll understand the environment, they'll understand what to do about it. But I think the issue now is we need micro-level understanding bottom-up, not macro understanding top-down. And the big issue with climate change, and myself and Anna, who works for me, and Beth have been arguing this for ages, is you cannot solve climate change by getting people together in a conference to agree they will do something, because that means everybody else gives up on it. Until people take micro-sacrifices in their community and realize the impact in their community, then the dispositional state, which is key for complexity, we call it the substrate technically, the substrate will not permit politicians to do what they need to do. And everybody is focusing on telling other people what they should do. Nobody is focusing on engendering those micro-sacrifices at a hyper-local level so that the substrate changes. And part of my big frustration is you can get a lot of money, IDG is an example, you can get millions to get people together in a workshop to decide how things should be. But getting money to actually engender people at a hyper-local level to do something, nobody will fund. And systems thinking succeeds because it allows politicians to get together in a workshop, produce a wonderful report and say they intend to think holistically, but then not change. So change has got to be micro bottom up, and it's got to be, and the key phrase here, it's got to be epistemically just. Yeah, epistemic injustice is one of the major problems of our time.
I have actually, for years, I've had my own design studio. And it's, okay, I'm going to say it, feminist systems thinking studio. And I wanted to be super active, so I only do those things. I only do like bottom-up testing and pilots and experimenting, because just as you're saying, I think there's so much power in that. And most of the time, they fail, and they're super ugly, and they look horrendous, and it's like, it's, as you're saying, it's not this beautiful systems thinking maps, but it's real work. And I think for me personally, it's been frustrating and hard, and you know, I don't know what I'm doing, and am I doing the right thing? But I hope that I am somewhere.
Okay, so let's build on that, because I think this is important. We've been looking at this for ages, right? And part of the problem is, if you want to get money in a local community, you have to be good at advocacy, which means you have to use the language of power in order to get power, and then you become like the powerful. And this is a big problem in the development community. And also, the granularity is wrong. And granularity is a key concept. You should move to complexity and stop using this. Granularity is wrong. So finely grained things, you can afford higher rates of failure, which is what you found. So one of the things we're now looking at, and we're taking two things. One is that natural size of 5 or 7. We're also taking the fact that people evolve to make decisions in roles, not as people. Yeah, ritual changes how we see the world. And again, this is against the sort of psychological focus. And why people still use Freud and Jung, I don't know. I mean, two late 20th century psychologists who abuse their patients are not the role model for modern society. But, that's another issue, all right? So we evolved to make decisions in roles. So what we're now looking at is we can define 4 or 6 roles, for example. We're doing this in medical stuff, we're doing development. And then we have another key principle it's the unseen observer. Yeah, it's called the panopticon effect. So basically, you know you're being observed, but you don't know who's observing you. And that creates a level of honesty which you wouldn't have otherwise. So what we're doing is saying, well, look, if you've got 4 roles and they come together, and you accept a completely anonymous 5th role, you don't know who it is, it might be a person, it might be a committee, it might be AI, it might change, it doesn't matter. And you all agree, and you do narrative recording of the context, the decision you're going to make, and the consequence, then you can spend $500, $10,000 without asking permission. Right? Now, what that allows us to do is to have 100 experiments and allow the real investment to follow the things which work, not the people who say they can make something. And this is a design principle in many ways. And what we're basically saying is, look, failure is critical for learning, So we need to create an environment in which we can, 100 failures and 1 success is good news. And the minute you go to coarsely grained interventions, which is what people are prepared to fund, nothing will fail. I mean, there's a golden rule, if you don't know it, if you're in IT, get a big government project because you'll get paid even if you fail, because the government can't say its IT project failed. Yeah, so they'll always pay you. And that, to me, depresses me, right? So I think granularity, obliquity, failure, these are all key aspects of designing, of allowing a different type of society to emerge. It's not our role to design what that society is. And populists get this, but liberals don't. That's depressing.
Yeah, maybe bringing to that to this room and also to this context in Finland, that I think we are really interested also to see, not knowing what it will look like, but how can we start to change how we work together, which is the theme of the day. What small kind of changes can we do in how we relate? Because we are now in a situation where it's difficult to get grants and people are competing, and we are collaborating, but are we really collaborating? And how can we do some adjustments there to see, and also work across the sectors with the funders and with can we take this turbulent situation that we are in when the state fundings are being cut, and see, could we organize ourselves differently? And we're getting a lot of advice here. How could we?
Just to throw one other thing on this, because part of my role at the moment, because the frameworks we've done have been used by the Ukrainian army, which I'm really proud of, because they understand complexity because they're in that. But one of the things, and I'm working with NATO at the moment on the future of command and control, because we're going to do that. The big argument I'm making at the moment is joint command is not land, sea, air, cyber and space. It needs to add civilian. And what we're now, and this is the big issue, it's the issue for Finland, it's the issue for East Poland, it's the issue for the Baltics, and it was the issue in the Ukraine. Civilian resilience is now part of military planning. Yeah? Now, I think that's something we all need to recognize, and I'll be brutal about this. We are in a state of war with Russia, and we're refusing to acknowledge it. All right? And war happens. And when war happens, you have to have a response to war, and that requires your population. And the key lesson on this, it needs to be aligned. Now, sorry, I'm going to indulge myself here. If you look at antelope behavior, there's a wonderful exercise you can run with people. So you can't do it in a lecture theatre, but you need a flat space. You tell everybody to identify their best friend and their worst enemy. And before you do this, you basically say, don't look at anybody or say anything, and you can pick people at random. But people never do, so it's worth videoing it for study later, all right? It tells you a lot about the organisation. Then you say, organise yourself so your best friend is between you and your worst enemy. And the group dissipates. Then you switch the rule and say, protect your friend from your enemy, and the group clumps together in the middle of the room in seconds. It's a wonderful form of embodied education. That's how antelope avoid predators. They identify another antelope, kids love this, by the markings on their bum. Yeah, so, there's a human aspect on this I don't want to get into. They identify another antelope by mark, and they position themselves between that antelope and the predator. That means the herd stays together, but it doesn't have a purpose or a goal or a destination, but it stays together. Now, one of the big things we're working on in research at the moment is how do we actually create alignment without a goal, because we need people to stay together under conditions of adversity. And again, that's that micro-level interaction.
Yeah, somehow. When you explain this and feel this, this is the challenge, this is the context we are in right now, if we compare to the historical context of the First World War in Finland, where what we needed was, arms and that kind of organizing. But now we need another kind of organizing, and to be resilient. And I'm also just, like this morning when I was thinking about, do I know the other lived experiences? Am I able to empathize with them? And also just thinking of the migration flows. We to which extent can we hold together when we start to see a lot of people coming in and a lot of all this. So
One bit of good news, I was in a war game the other day. Sorry, I do a lot of war gaming. Putin invades Finland. Finland gets its 10% back. Because Putin underestimates the Finns. So I thought you'd like that one. Right? Underestimating the Finns, I think, is a good final point.
we'll be ready.
Thank you so much. Do you want to?
No, a final last thing is just that I recently read the statistics of how much money we put into warfare and military and how much we put into peacekeeping.
It's scary. Yeah.
Amen.
Yes. Maybe we end there and we think about that during the coffee break.
It's good. Thank you. Thank you so much.